Hey, what's going on, good people? It's Gardner Douglas, your oyster ninja. This has been a long-awaited conversation. Today, I'm talking to Miss Deb Freeman, whose writings focus on Black foodways throughout America, which can be found in Eater, the local plate, Plate Magazine, Garden and Gun, so many more. She is the producer and host of Finding Edna Lewis, host and creator of Setting the Table, a multi-award winning podcast, including Podcast of the Year by International Association of Culinary Professionals. I've been looking at different podcasts and different shows, and the one that stood out was Shannon Sharp, but I better not say his name too loud these days because he's trending. Bless his heart. But I like the way he does his intros. So I was like, you know what? Let me see what I can find. And you got it all scripted out for me. So you made it easy for me. I didn't have to look too far.
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here. Finally, I'm very happy to be here.
We met a few years ago at the Thomas Downing dinner, hosted by the Farm Alliance up in Baltimore. And I instantly wanted to have you on the podcast for sure. One, because somebody else knew Thomas Downing, um, for one, and for two, I just could feel the energy that that you brought off. I want to start. I know we're going to talk about Miss Edna. How did you start this whole writing thing and just being a great podcast host? How did you get into this lane?
Yeah, I mean, so about 10 years ago, I started writing about Black foodways. And so what I realized is once I started researching, it was a complete rabbit hole because the more I read and found out, the more there was to find out. And so I realized I really didn't know much about Black foodways. I thought I did, but I had no idea about, to your point, Thomas Downing or James Hemings or, Lena Richards or any of these amazing people who have added to the culinary narrative of our country. Had no idea about them. And so it kind of, in some ways, fell into place that I was like, you know what, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to write about this. And so I did exactly that for every publication I could for many years. And then with the podcast, how that came about was basically during COVID, I sent a DM on what was then Twitter and was like, hey, Whetstone, I heard that y'all are looking for podcast hosts, can I throw my hat in the ring? And it really just kind of grew from there. Um, but yeah, that's really where all started. The foundation really was writing and knowing, yeah, just having a very clear vision of what I wanted to write about and really give names to folks that either have been forgotten by time or people who've not been talked about who really deserve that. So yeah, that's how that all spun about just because I became obsessed essentially.
So I'm curious about your obsession, first of all. I want to know how you found Thomas Downing.
Yeah, so I wrote an article about Thomas Downing and essentially making the argument that he created what we know as fine dining today. He really kind of establishes the stereotypical template that we have about fine dining, the tablecloths, the chandeliers, and the amount of forks and drapery, all of that kind of, a lot of that stems from Mr. Downing. And so that's really where it started from this article. And in that research, really, it was a couple of things. One, it was trying to find out what he was doing at the time and how he was able to purchase a building, in the 1800s. Even in New York, he was still a Black man, so that was not exactly easy. But the other part of it was I was also very interested in his Virginia connections and how did he grow up and finding out that he was not enslaved and Protestants kind of converted his, what would have been his master and all of that sort of thing. And it was a really interesting story. So really it was, obviously a lot of Google research, but it was also a lot of going through archival material to understand where he came from in Virginia.
Now, I'm sure, I hope my listeners know who Thomas Downing is because we kind of skipped over that part. Who would you say Thomas Downing is, just in like a quick summary?
Where Thomas Downing is important because he changes the way that Americans view oysters. So previous to him opening up his restaurant, oysters were seen as poor people food. You would buy them on a cart on the street, for pennies. And it wasn't, really seen as anything fancy, much like lobsters were back in the day, where people kind of thought that was food for prisoners and for poor people. And so after Thomas Downing, because he, took such care in choosing oysters and then creating dishes that really highlighted the oyster, post Thomas Downing, you see oysters in the context more of what we see today, which is at an upper end restaurant, with ice and champagne and the lemon and all of that. But the oyster really had a humble beginning. But because of Mr. Downing, he flips that on its ear.
That is one of the best, quickest summaries I've heard. I mean, honestly, I knew it was a hard way to do that just in a few, but I wanted to, just enlighten the listeners about Mr. Thomas Downing. And it's so much more. I have a podcast, you have a podcast, and you can, a quick Google search. I feel like so many people now are talking about Thomas Downing and why he's important to the culture. Um, I want to thank you first of all for that. What is Black Foodways to you?
Yeah, Black Foodways is two things really. One, in its most basic definition, it's the food that is cooked by Black people. But to take it a step further, how then does that food influence America, and how does it leave the South and leave enslaved hands and become essentially a money-making kind of endeavor, but also becomes a part of American culture? There are dishes that folks around the world think about as American. They immediately think barbecue. They think, fried chicken and that sort of thing. And that's Black food. That is food that we uniquely created in America. And so I really want to be very careful to say American fried chicken and American barbecue, because certainly that exists all over the world. But the way in which we understand those two dishes today, or those two genres of food, is really because of enslaved African Americans.
But when I was doing my research on you, I noticed how your titles kind of stood out to me also. Very
Mm.
thoughtful titles. And I got a couple notes here.
Oh,
Let's see here.
I'm like, what
um,
is he about to pull out? Okay.
yes, this is Juneteenth might be the most American holiday of all.
Mm,
Here's looking at Q,
yeah.
freedom, finances, and fried chicken.
Hmm.
So I want to ask you, how important are the titles of the things that you write and you talk about in the podcast?
Oh, it's extremely important. If it's almost as important as the content. I take a lot of time to really figure out what title will make sense, because I want you to read that, and if it doesn't immediately discuss what the topic is or let the reader know what the topic is, I would hope that you are intrigued enough to want to read it, right? And so like one of the very first articles I wrote about food, the title was "A Woman's Places in the Kitchen." And it was about women chefs in the Hampton Roads area, and people were just like, "Oh my God," it's just like you have to read. You have to read the article, people. Like, I'm not making some anti-feminist statement, but it was just kind of funny. And I think that was the moment where I was like, oh, so titles mean something to people, titles can do something. And so that's when I decided to be really intentional about it. But yeah, if you had a title like Black women and fried chicken in Virginia, I mean, you're a half a step away from an academic journal entry versus, your finances, fried chicken, and what I mean. Like it's a different layer, even though the material is just as academic and rigorous as anything else.
Kind of you are in a good location, or Hampton Roads is a good location where it's even like me being from the shore, like when I say I'm from, or people always ask me, are you from the South? And I say I'm from the Eastern Shore of Virginia, which we consider that the South. But you know, a southern state might not consider that the South, but just, you know, again, we got the migration people coming up, and that was their, you know, their post. That's where, you know, some people stayed, some people migrated, kept going, was an in between place. As far as your upbringing, how do you think that's played on, you know, the stories that you're telling now?
That's a great question. I think growing up in Virginia Beach and growing up in Norfolk, which again is never Norfolk, is always Norfolk. Just so everybody knows, please don't say that. But growing up in that area was really interesting because you, on the one hand, there's my grandmother cooking really traditional kind of quote unquote Southern dishes every single day. I was very blessed that she was a great cook and to be able to come home and eat, turkey wings with gravy and collards or cornbread or any plethora of things because she was an amazing cook. But on the other hand, my grandmother lived in New York for a while, so she also loved Jewish delis. So like then we've got my grandmother and I going out and trying to find a Reuben sandwich or a hot dog with sauerkraut and like oh, well, you gotta make sure this is on rye and pumpernickel, like, which is completely different to what the stuff was that she was cooking. But in Hampton Roads, there's also a huge Filipino contingent, right? So, like, eating lumpia and eating pancit, which are two of my favorite things, like, all of these things are coexisting at once. Like, of course, there were some Latino people and other ethnicities, but really the big three are going to be Black, white, and Filipino. And so for me, that was it. Like I was just shocked. I would go places and be like, "Y'all don't have any Filipino food? Like what are you doing?" Or when I would go to New York and be like, where do y'all get smothered turkey wings from?" Like, and they're looking at me like I'm crazy. So I think it's just an interesting mix of things. And I believe that my grandmother's curiosity and excitement about food just kind of like poured into me, which is why I get very excited, very curious about food. So it was a definitely an interesting place to grow up and not to, to kind of bring it back to Downing, seafood, right? Like I remember growing up and my grandfather catching spots and catching croakers and bringing them home for dinner. You know what I mean? And then obviously crabs. Let's talk about blue crabs, right? So, we have a meal called fried crab, and not fried soft shell crabs, but fried hard shell crab, which is just amazing. It's one of my favorite things to eat. And so, like, so you've got the seafood component mixed in. So it's a really interesting place to grow up in with different dynamics and food that you don't necessarily see everywhere, but no one ever talks about Hampton Roads. No one talks about being able to, eat, oysters and clams and spots and all of this every summer. You're going to eat that pretty much every night for dinner. Not many people talk about that, which is sad. So yes, that was a very long answer to your question. Yes, Hampton Roads absolutely shaped the way I look at food
No,
and
it's all good. And you know, the funny thing is, I was literally just talking about spots and croakers. I want to say yesterday. Oh, because I was saying I want to get back home, because I want to get some fishing in because I haven't had fresh spot or
mm,
fresh croaker in so long. Now, this next question is, I was gonna save it for the end when we talked about Miss Edna, but I'm gonna go ahead and bring it in now, and I'm gonna tell you mine.
yeah,
Um, so the question is, what dish would you attach to your personal story and journey? I'm gonna tell you mine first here.
yeah, yeah. Tell
Now,
me.
mine, because I feel like our stories are kind of intertwined. And that's the thing about food is I feel it connects people more than it separates us. Food is
Mhm.
always going to bring people together. It's always a communion of getting together and having a good time. Don't matter what culture um, that you are. But to go back to my plate, I can remember my grandma. getting fish from the neighbors where they've gone out and got, they've been fishing croakers, perch, catfish, but we'll just say a fresh fish, crowd croaker spot. Um, ooh, oh man, macaroni and cheese. Broccoli went with everything. Watermelon or honeydew, cantaloupe for dessert. I don't know if you know about sun tea, but sun tea out on the porch, that's been
Hmm.
brewing all day.
Hmm.
Um, my gosh. I'm gonna let you go ahead and answer that now. Because mine could be all over the place and I gotta have some yams or some sweet potatoes. Oh my
Hmm.
gosh.
Yeah, no, I think mine is a little all over the place too. I mean, I guess I would probably, the first thing that comes to mind is chicken dumplings. So there's a
Mm.
recipe that Miss Lewis has, but the funny thing is my grandmother made it completely different than what you see. Like Miss Lewis's version is very elegant. It's in a light broth. My nana, first of all, called it chicken dumplings. I had no idea, excuse me, chicken pastry. Like I didn't know what chicken dumplings were. Like I knew what chicken pastry was, even though it's the same thing. And so I have very tangible memories of her making that, and rolling out the dough with like an iced tea glass, on a brown paper bag. She would throw flour on it and roll out the dough before dropping it in the pot. Um, but I could I can taste that right now. I can smell it and everything, like in this exact moment. And so when I saw in Miss Lewis's cookbook that there was a recipe for chicken dumplings, like it really, I felt a very real connection. Although it's not made exactly the same way, I still felt like, okay, this is familiar. You know what I mean? Like there still is this tie, even if it's slightly different, which is the really cool thing about Black foodways and Southern foodways in a lot of ways. It may not be exactly the same based on where you're from, but there's always going to be some common thread. There's always going to be some kind of connection.
Love that. Let's talk about this new project that you're working on with Miss Edna Lewis. Um, if you want to just talk about the project and who is Edna Lewis?
Yeah, so Edna Lewis was really a woman who, in my opinion, and many other people's opinion, changed the way Americans looked at Southern food. Um, even today, though, unfortunately, there's a stereotypical thought process when it comes to Southern food, and people think of the greatest hits, if you will. People think about fried chicken, mac and cheese, all of these really heavy just like you're going to eat this and you're going to take a nap immediately kind of foods, right? But Southern food is so much more than that. It's very seasonal. A lot of it is vegetable based. It's not, you're not eating fried chicken every day, and I think that when Taste of Country Cooking comes out, that really illuminated a different side of Southern food for folks. And she was also a very early pioneer in the farm to table movement, which a term now, which is just everybody knows what it is. It needs no explanation. But when she was doing this, even as far back in 1949, when she was the executive chef at Cafe Nicholson in New York, she was doing exactly that. But people didn't call it that. But all of a sudden now it's trendy. So she's really an early pioneer of making sure that you're going to get the most beautiful ingredients that you possibly can. And honestly, finally, she is a prolific writer. When you read her cookbooks, particularly Taste of Country Cooking, which is my favorite, you are going to get a narrative and a snapshot of a Black town at a very particular time in history. And so you're going to get this narrative that goes along with the recipes that you don't often find even today. And that's really important because without that, we don't know what folks were doing in the 1930s in a rural town to really create such elegant and expert food. And I don't think that elegant and expert necessarily go along with what a lot of people can call Black food and Southern food. And so I think she really bridges that gap.
Dang, you just killing all of my questions, but that's just that's just that's just how much of a professional you are. I love the way you talked about bridging that gap of and changing the stereotypes of what people think of soul food, southern cooking. all of that. A quote she said, one of the greatest pleasures of my life has been that I have never stopped learning about good food, or, yeah, good food and good cooking. What do you think,
Mm.
or how does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a great quote of hers because you will see throughout her cookbooks, and she has several, she's always talking about Freetown, Virginia. So, like, let's set the stage for that. She's never ashamed of where she comes from. In fact, she is a champion of it. You can tell that she loves this place and this time very specifically and very deeply. But throughout her career, she moves to New York and she learns how to create other dishes. She goes to the further south to South Carolina, for instance. She's in Charleston for some time and learns about red rice and learns about other dishes that you wouldn't necessarily find in Virginia. And so what's really cool is that she gets to evolve and like, you can see throughout the cookbooks in the progression that her aperture increases, and so now there are different recipes that you wouldn't have seen, 15, 20 years before. And then after doing that, she goes back to New York in her 70s to be an executive chef at Cajun Toner and think about what she's seen by this time, what she's tasted. And so I think that it's really kind of encouragement to not just chefs, but to people in food to stay curious and not get locked into, well, this is how something has to taste. This is how something has to be prepared. Not necessarily, and so I think that's just a reminder to all of us to be open-minded and not take this. I mean, it's serious. The work is serious, the craft is serious, but not taking ourselves so seriously that you can't be open to new things.
Think Edna Lewis would think about the food culture today?
I think she would be a little disappointed. We are constantly going through fast food places. We are, we have lost, a lot of people have lost touch with where food comes from and understanding that there are people growing food. What we get in the grocery store is just a sad representation when it comes to fruits and vegetables and meat to that for that point of what food should taste like. I think she would probably be disappointed. Um, but I think that because there's a popularity in farmers markets, and those sorts of things, I think she would feel good about that piece of it. Um, and there's kind of been this rise of African Americans moving back to the South and reclaiming farming. I did an episode about that on my podcast about younger Black people coming back to the South to try and grow things. I think she would be happy about that. But overall, our food culture has just gotten away from us in so many ways, and we are not eating, you know, the a tomato was perfectly ripe. We're eating a tomato year round, and that tomato has been frozen for months and then shipped to us, and it's not even ripe, and we're eating a tomato that was made like 6 months ago. So no, I don't think she would. I think she would have some concerns.
I honestly want to talk more about the food today now, but um, let's say that for another conversation. When you were talking about Miss Lewis, and her evolution of her thought process and her skills in the kitchen because of the way she traveled and conversations she probably had with other cooks and chefs, um, just the evolution was like super broad and
Hmm.
broader. It got broader and broader.
Hmm.
How do you think your writing has changed over the years with each project you've completed?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. I think that probably because I've learned more, I think that I'm able to make connection points a little bit easier. And I also think that I'm also able to reference things from years ago. So, like, I did this super deep dive into James Hemings and The Virginia Housewife, which was a cookbook that was written after his death, but it had French techniques in this cookbook. And, honestly, that had to be attributed to Hemings because he went to France and did the law and not the original author as a Mary Randolph. So that I write that roughly 10 years ago, right? Fast forward to this project that while filming Find Edna Lewis, when you start to dive into the content, um there's a Virginia French connection, and that actually was written about in the 1800s, that Virginia cooking is half French, half Virginian. And so you're able to start to pull that out of these recipes and the things that she's making. And so I'm able to make that connection. Oh, well, Charlottesville is like 20 miles from Freetown. So how hard would it have been in a Black community in particular to kind of have this cross pollination of French skills and technique that then migrate and show up in Miss Lewis's work years and years later, right? So I think that had I not done that work 10, 12 years ago, I probably would not have made that connection today.
Look at these light bulbs just going off everywhere. Um, so you've done a lot of groundwork, have you, as you just, spoke about. Um, Now in the food scene, do any chefs stand out to you?
Oh, a ton. I'm so excited by what's going on. Actually, there's a competitor on Top Chef now, Chef Tristan out in Houston. Um, Epps, I believe is his last name. And he's doing some really cool stuff. And I'm really excited about his work. I'm always excited about Mashama Bailey, of course, because I think she's doing really beautiful work there too. Um, Someone who doesn't get in my opinion, kind of like the spotlight enough is Chris Scott. Chris Scott is up in New York, and he was on Top Chef a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, a while ago. But he's really doing something interesting. He has a cookbook out called Homage, and he is marrying oh gosh, Amish flavors and African American foodways, and he calls it Amish soul. And I think that's a really cool way of merging those two cultures together, and seeing the parallels in them, and then elevating that to a different level. So he deserves all the shine all the time because I think he's a good dude, but more importantly, he really is committed to Black foodways and then taking another step beyond kind of the box that sometimes a lot of Black chefs can be put in.
So right now, where can we find discovering Miss Edna Lewis? Like where can we tune in?
Yeah, so Finding Edna Lewis, you can watch it on the PBS app, or you can go on YouTube, PBS Food. Underneath that, you'll be able to find Finding Edna Lewis. And you have to go quick because it's only up for another couple of months. But I highly encourage everyone to watch it. It's a really, and I'm not saying this because I did it, but it really is a beautiful, just a thank you to Miss Lewis, and just, I really hope that more people start talking about her and being excited about her work and her legacy.
Have you started working on a new project yet?
I have not as of yet. Right now, I'm touring the film across the country,
Mm-hmm.
which is taking up a ton of time,
I
um,
bet.
but in the best way possible because, I get to watch it with new people every time and see kind of how folks react and what they are moved by. So, I'm excited to do that. So right now, I'm touring it until. I think the last one right might be in September. So the next few months are a lot of travel, but in the best way possible. But there are some ideas brewing. Um, there's some things in my head that I can't quite talk about yet, but might be happening soon.
Well, we love to wait and watch watch later. Uh I can I'm gonna assume that it's something awesome just because like everything that you touch has like gone to gold And you know, I really do appreciate the thoughtfulness you put in your projects. You know, it's not something you just throw together and say, "Oh, well, this is done," and not really care about, you know, how the reader digested or the listener digested, the watcher. I can tell it's a lot of thoughtfulness that goes into this, and I really appreciate that love. You know, it's different to see. It's not different. It shouldn't be different. It should be a standard. But when you can see like the love that somebody puts into a project or into anything, you know what I mean? Your
Mhm.
work, your day to day, how you go about. Um, it's just it's amazing to see that passion and for it to speak for you, and you don't have to say any words. So you definitely did that, and you know, for all the listeners, you know, right now, where can they find you? Where can they follow your journey and maybe your next watch or whatever you're doing?
Yeah, so I post fairly regularly on Instagram under Audiophile Girl with a PH9F. You can find me there. My website is deb-freeman.com, and I tend to have a lot of my work, um, my written work that is on there. And if you want to listen to the podcast, Setting the Table is out wherever you get your podcast listening from. So,
Well, again, thank you again for taking time. I'm glad we finally got this wrapped up.
yes,
Um, this was a good conversation. This was a
awesome.
real good conversation, and I feel like we left enough unsaid um, to come back and circle back around.
Les, I'm there.
All right, thank you.